You're listening to Below the Surface, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
A missing person, a strange death, a vanished vehicle, a series of unanswerable questions. In so many true crime mysteries, the answers remain elusive. But in many instances, the clues lead right to the water's edge, and sometimes the truth lies below the surface. Welcome back to Below the Surface. I'm your host, Olivia, and today I'm unpacking the case of one of the most infamous historical figures of all time, Grigori Rasputin. When his body was found floating under a layer of ice in the Malaya Nevka River in St. Petersburg in December of 1916, his drowning only added to the rumour, scandal and myth surrounding the man known to Russia as the Mad Monk. Urban legends claim that Rasputin survived stabbings, poisonings and bullets. The only element strong enough to kill him in the end was the icy waters of St. Petersburg's Little Nevka River. But is that actually the case? Let's dive in. While his life ended with him being known as one of Russia's most divisive public and political figures, Grigori Rasputin came from humble beginnings. Born to Siberian peasants on January 21st, 1869, he grew up in the small farming community of Pokrovskaya in western Siberia. In addition to farming, his father was a government courier who travelled between the villages of Tobolsk and Shumen to make deliveries. While little else is known about Rasputin's early years, some reports claim he came from a large family with 8 other siblings, though only he and his younger sister survived to adulthood. Most scholars believe that Rasputin was illiterate and he had never received any formal education, as very few Russian peasants were educated in the late 19th century. The first official records about his life began in 1886 when he was 17 years old. He left his parents and travelled around 150 miles from his home along the Chura River to a small village named AbJack. It's unclear why he made this journey, though some scholars believe it was to visit the village's monastery. Raised as a Russian Orthodox, it would not have been uncommon for a young man like Rasputin to make such a pilgrimage for his faith. While staying in AbJack, he fell in love with a young woman named Praskovia Dobrovina, and they married a year later. They welcomed 7 children over the course of their marriage, though only 3 survived to adulthood. He moved his family back to his hometown in Pokrovskaya, raising his children in his father's household. No historical texts report how Rasputin supported his young growing family, though he took 2 other short pilgrimages to visit monasteries in the first 10 years of his marriage. But something inexplicable happened in 1897 when Rasputin made his 3rd pilgrimage to the St. Nicholas Monastery in Verkhoturye, around 430 miles from his home. He spent several months at St. Nicholas, where it's alleged that the monks taught him to read and write, and he began studying theology. He also seemed to undergo some kind of personal transformation, as when he returned to Pokrovskaya, he announced that he was a vegetarian, and many of the villagers swore that he seemed different. He swore off alcohol, though he had never been a heavy drinker, and while he'd always been a religious observer, the village noted that he prayed and he sang more fervently following his pilgrimage. Whatever he discovered at the St. Nicholas Monastery turned him into a holy wanderer, and he spent the next several years travelling the country in search of further religious transformation. Between 1897 and 1905, he was gone for months and sometimes years at a time, searching out holy sites and monasteries throughout the Russian Empire. But for the small amount of time that he did reside in Pokrovskaya in between these journeys, Rasputin became a religious celebrity in his village. He began holding secret prayer meetings in his father's basement, and while this activity put him at odds with leaders of the local church, it gained him a dedicated following of friends and neighbours. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's fame as a holy man was growing. And when he made a pilgrimage to the city of Kazan in 1904, the local religious leaders were so impressed by his intellect and his charisma that they provided him with a reference letter to the largest monastery in St. Petersburg, the Alexander Nevsky Theological Seminary. Rasputin travelled immediately to St. Petersburg and made an excellent impression on the monastery's head archbishop, Theophan of Poltava. He invited Rasputin to live with him, and the two built a fast friendship that eventually led to Rasputin's involvement in many of St. Petersburg's intellectual salons, where Russian elites gathered to discuss everything from politics and philosophy to religion. Rasputin became a bit of a curiosity at these meetings. He was quite different than most of the theologians who frequented the salons. Since he'd grown up with little to no formal education, all of his perceived wisdom and experience came from travelling the country and speaking with local people, not from studying in academics. He was also reported to have strange mannerisms, which may have simply been attributed to his humble beginnings as a Siberian peasant, instead of the aristocratic upbringing of many of the religious leaders of the time. But these differences made him interesting enough that he'd soon amassed a following of Russia's most elite figures. And through these interactions, Rasputin received the highest invitation of all, a meeting with Russia's Tsar Nicholas Romanov. On November 1st of 1905, Rasputin went to the Peterhof Palace to meet with Tsar Nicholas and his wife Alexandra for the first time. While there is no record of what was discussed at this first meeting, the Romanovs must have been impressed with Rasputin, because when he sent a telegram that he had a religious relic he wanted to gift the royal family, he was readily invited back for a second visit. On this occasion, he was introduced to the Romanov children, and the couple asked for his holy blessing on their young son Alexei, who had suffered from haemophilia. The royal doctors had a difficult time stopping his hemorrhages, which led to him spending most of his time in bed. But it was alleged that when Rasputin sat with him during a bleeding episode, the young child calmed quickly and his hemorrhaging became much more manageable. While it's unclear exactly what Rasputin did, some reports suggest he used hypnotism to keep the little boy in a calm state that allowed his body to naturally slow the bleeds. Others suggest that Rasputin's prayers simply calmed Tsarina Alexandra, which in turn made her son less anxious. Whatever he did, Rasputin's presence seemed to greatly assist Alexei's health, and so between 1905 and 1913, the royal family invited Rasputin to attend the young boy at the palace on several occasions. As he seemed to be the only person capable of slowing or stopping her son's hemorrhages, Tsarina Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin possessed divine healing powers. An incident in the summer of 1912 would solidify this belief for the entire imperial family. In July of 1912, Alexei suffered a large hematoma after a carriage ride that left him in such pain and delirium his family feared he might die. But Rasputin had returned home to his own family and was not able to come to the palace. Alexandra sent him a telegram instead begging for prayer. Rasputin responded immediately that God had heard her prayer and that her son would not die. He instructed Alexandra to not let the doctors bother him and to let him rest, which she did, though that seemed counterproductive at the time. But within 48 hours of Alexandra receiving Rasputin's reply, Alexei's hemorrhage evaporated. The royal doctor later claimed that this was medically unexplainable, and ever after, the Romanov family believed Rasputin was a holy miracle worker sent by God to keep their heir to the throne alive. Now, as a side note, contemporary historians cite a possible scientific explanation for this miracle. Early 20th century doctors often prescribed aspirin for pain, but did not know it was a blood thinner until the 1950s. Therefore, every time they gave Alexei aspirin to counteract the pain of his condition, the medicine would have greatly exacerbated his hematomas and led to more bleeding. Rasputin would not have known that the aspirin was the problem, but he would have been able to discern that the doctor's presence seemed to make the boy sicker, so he told Alexandra to keep the doctors away. This meant aspirin would not have been administered, and coupled with calm rest, Alexei's blood would have potentially been able to clot, and the hematoma would have been absorbed back into his body. But without understanding this, Rasputin seemed to truly have magical powers, a belief that led to an elevated placement within the inner royal circle. By 1913, the Romanovs considered Rasputin a member of the imperial family. He reportedly had a close relationship with the 4 princesses, as well as Alexei, and all the children referred to Rasputin as our friend. In addition, the Tsar gave him a royal household position as the official lamplighter, whose job it was to tend to the lamps that illuminated the palace's many religious icons. This title gave Rasputin private and unlimited access to both the palace and the royal family. And while it's unclear exactly how much control or influence he really had over the Tsar's political decisions, his sudden rise in royal favoritism upset the power balance of the Russian court and the Orthodox Church. His upbringing as an uneducated Siberian peasant made him a target for St. Petersburg's aristocratic elites, who saw him as a political meddler who would bring down the monarchy. And while his particular brand of religious fervour garnered him a large and devoted following, he was not an ordained bishop or monk in the Orthodox Church, and this made him a dangerous heretic to the St. Petersburg archbishops. Rumours were soon circulating that Rasputin was a charlatan, accepting bribes and sexual favours from his following while offering them spiritual cleansings in return. Several women came forward to say that they had been sexually assaulted by him, but while investigations were opened into these alleged crimes, there are no surviving records to indicate that any of these rumours were true or able to be corroborated. Based on the letters sent between Rasputin and the royal family, a very different picture of him arises. Both Alexandra and Nicholas viewed Rasputin as a close friend they could discuss philosophy, religion, and life events with. The Russian political scene was a hotbed of intrigue, lies, and social backstabbing that Nicholas was terrible at navigating. And the Russian people detested Alexandra for being a German-born princess and not Russian. Her nerves could not take the disdain from either the court or the people, and the imperial family had grown increasingly isolated. They had no one to talk to or lean on without fearing ulterior motives, but Rasputin did not appear to have any. Aside from asking Nicholas to approve him changing his last name from Rasputin to Rasputin Nove, he never asked for money or favours. The children enjoyed his company, and his ability to keep Alexei healthy was seen as miraculous. He appeared to the imperial couple to be nothing more than a simple and devout holy man. However, outside of the palace, Rasputin often patronised prostitutes and had several extramarital affairs with women whose husbands were out of town. He was also known to drink excessively by that point, and he often went dancing at nightclubs. While none of these activities were any different than what most of the Russian court members got up to, they provided just enough truth to fuel the rumours of Rasputin's licentious and heretical double life. But despite authorities bringing accusations against Rasputin to the Tsar's attention, Nicholas did not take them seriously. He viewed Rasputin as a religious miracle sent to the imperial family to keep the heir to the throne alive. But even after several attempts were made to drive a political wedge between Rasputin and Nicholas, the Tsar kept Rasputin and instead banished the politicians and priests who resented him. Nicholas's loyalty to a seemingly heretical peasant was seen as a betrayal by both aristocracy and the Orthodox Church, and both factions felt that Rasputin had gained an inexplicably deep influence over the imperial family. This was especially true after Nicholas left with Russian troops to join World War I, leaving Alexandra in charge of the country. The aristocracy believed that the orders coming from the palace were not the Tsar or Alexandra's words, but were Rasputin's. Rumours and blame soon spread throughout the city that there was only one explanation for this level of control, and that was that Rasputin was having a sexual affair with Alexandra and was using her as a political puppet. These rumours gained traction after Rasputin visited a nightclub, and in a drunken stupor, he told the room that Alexandra only bowed to one throne, at which point he unbuckled his trousers to show his privates. However, later documentation would reveal that one of Rasputin's religious rivals had paid the nightclub owner to spread this rumour, and there are no sources that prove he ever actually said this. But as World War I raged on the continent and Russia's economy crashed, the aristocracy blamed Rasputin's influence over Alexandra for the soaring inflation and the destruction of Russia's feudal social system. Whether due to these mounting rumours or simply by coincidence, Rasputin left St. Petersburg and returned to his Siberian hometown in 1914. But his enemies were not content to stay in St. Petersburg, as many believed the country would be better off if he was eliminated. One particular religious rival, a priest named Ilyador, paid an assassin to follow him all the way back to Siberia. On July 12th of 1914, the assassin stabbed Rasputin in the stomach as he came out of his house. It should have been a fatal blow, but he managed to hang on until he got to a hospital in Shumen. After extensive surgery, Rasputin made a slow and long recovery. In some level of personal triumph, he returned to St. Petersburg in 1916 to take up his position as Alexei's personal healer. But by that winter, another group was plotting for Rasputin's permanent removal from the royal family, this time by any means necessary.
Want $1,000 weight loss medication for $50? It all starts with Roe's free GLP-1 insurance check. Just upload your insurance card to see if you have coverage, then relax. Over 200,000 people have qualified for a $50 copay through Roe. Go to roe.co/health. Half of covered patients have a $50 per month copay or less for medication, plus $145 monthly Roe membership fee. Deductible cost may apply and final cost varies by insurance plan. For safety information about GLP-1 medications, including boxed warning, go to roe.co/safety, RX only.
On the night of December 29, 1916, Russia's wealthiest aristocrat, Prince Felix Yusupov, invited Rasputin to his palace for drinks. What Rasputin didn't know was that he was being set up. Yusupov saw him as a threat to the Russian monarchy, and he had created an assassination plan with 4 other members of the nobility to take back the throne. Yusupov later published a memoir in which he described Rasputin's last hours. It was entitled Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination. It was published in 1927, 11 years after the murder. And for almost 100 years, the account provided by Yusupov spawned the infamous legacy and unkillability that most people attribute to Rasputin. In Yusupov's account, he claimed that Rasputin arrived at the palace a little after midnight on December 30th. They ushered him to a lavish basement room set up with an ornate table and chairs in front of a crackling fireplace, and they offered him tea, wine, and sweet cakes. Yusupov had instructed one of his fellow conspirators, Dr. Lazavet, to lace the cakes and wine with cyanide. But after Rasputin had eaten the cakes and drank the full bottle of wine, the conspirators were shocked to find that the cyanide seemed to have no effect on him. So Yusupov resorted to shooting Rasputin in the chest at point-blank range with a revolver. After Rasputin fell to the floor, Yusupov took Rasputin's hat and coat, and he and 2 of his co-conspirators drove back to Rasputin's apartment, and they walked inside to make it appear that Rasputin was home. They then returned to the palace to remove the body and clean up the scene. However, Yusupov alleged that when he went to hoist the body, Rasputin was not dead. He jumped up and attacked the prince. Somehow Rasputin had survived a bullet through the heart. The 2 men grappled for a few minutes before Yusupov escaped and ran out into the palace's courtyard with Rasputin in pursuit. Yusupov's co-conspirators shot Rasputin a second time, and he fell into a snowbank. The 5 men allegedly dragged Rasputin back into the palace to wrap his body in a curtain for transport, but he convulsed as they laid him out. Fearing he'd survived a second point-blank bullet, they put the revolver to his forehead and pulled the trigger, after which they beat his body with a club to ensure that he was dead. But as they were wrapping up the body, policemen's whistles were heard in the distance. They'd heard the gunshots and they were coming to investigate. The conspirators quickly threw Rasputin's body into their car and drove him to the Petrovsky Bridge around 20 minutes away. In the dark of the night, the men threw Rasputin's body into the Little Neevka River through an ice fishing hole below the bridge. On the off chance he'd survived a bullet to his brain, the sub-zero river would drown him. As the conspirators were disposing of Rasputin's body, Yusupov stayed behind to deal with the police. Assassinating one of the Tsar's favourite people was a brutal crime, even for a high-level noble like Yusupov. As he waited for authorities to arrive, Yusupov ordered one of his servants to kill a dog as a way to explain the gunshots and the blood in the courtyard. Despite this effort to hide the assassination, Rasputin's murder was front-page news the very next morning. The investigation into what had happened to Rasputin was quick and straightforward, as one of the co-conspirators accidentally admitted the murder to a policeman. From there, police were alerted by a local workman that they had found blood smears on the railing of the Petrovsky Bridge, as well as a man's bloody boot on the ice directly below. All that was left to do was pull Rasputin's body from the icy depths. On January 1st, only 2 days after he'd been assassinated, investigators located his body floating under the ice, 200 meters downstream. The Tsar ordered an autopsy to be performed, so Rasputin's body was pulled ashore with grappling hooks and was sent to the Academy of Military Medicine. While Prince Yusupov's later memoir painted Rasputin as a demon who could not be killed by normal means, his account was far from the truth. The original autopsy report from 1916 was lost during the Russian Revolution, but the coroner was interviewed a few years afterwards. In these interviews, he revealed that Rasputin had not evaded a normal death. Despite Yusupov's claims of plying Rasputin with poison cakes and wine, no traces of cyanide or any poisons were found in his stomach. He'd been shot 3 times, once in the forehead and 2 other bullets striking his liver and kidney. All 3 shots were fatal, and while it's possible he may have convulsed after being shot the first time, there is no possibility he would have survived long enough to attack Yusupov in the basement. His skull showed signs of being beaten around the head with a blunt object, and he bore several lacerations to his neck, side and back that were most likely from the grappling hooks used to exhume him from the river. These findings, coupled with the lack of water in Rasputin's lungs, led the coroner to rule that he had died via gunshot wounds to the head and the chest. Unlike Yusupov's account, Rasputin had not magically survived cyanide poisoning and bullets and had to be drowned in the river. He had been dead after the first shot. But how had such a legend taken hold if the autopsy results so plainly revealed the truth? For that, we have to look at the larger picture of what was happening in Russian society when Rasputin was killed. Rasputin's murder was the beginning of the end, not just for the Romanovs, but for the entire Russian Empire. In March of 1917, only 3 months after Rasputin was found in the river, riots erupted around St. Petersburg, demanding an end to the Russian monarchy. As violence spread through the city, Tsar Nicholas agreed to abdicate the throne, but the new provisional government put in place was quickly overthrown by the Bolsheviks' revolution only 8 months later. In that time, most of the imperial documentation surrounding Rasputin's murder were either lost or destroyed, and the anti-monarchists went so far as to exhume and burn his body following the March uprising, so his grave would not become a rallying location for any of the Tsar's supporters. The Bolsheviks imprisoned the Romanov family in 1917 and executed them by firing squad in the basement of a hidden Siberian house in 1918. The remaining members of the Russian court fled the country, seeking asylum in Europe. One of these asylum seekers was Prince Felix Yusupov. He settled in France, and having lost the majority of his fortune in his escape, he was in need of some quick cash by the late 1920s. But as the person who'd killed Rasputin, he knew the real story wouldn't sell many copies. Audiences wanted a thriller, and there had been enough bad press surrounding Rasputin when he was alive that it wouldn't have been hard for Yusupov to sell the version that quickly became infamous legend. A demon monk who could survive several attempts on his life was far more interesting than a religious peasant who was shot 3 times by a ruling class that feared his influence over their king. On the 100th anniversary of his assassination, a modern analysis of Rasputin's murder was performed by the University of Toronto professor Dr. Carolyn Harris for Smithsonian Magazine. In it, she revealed that while the Russian elite applauded Rasputin's killers when they appeared in public, the Russian peasants mourned his murder. They had lost one of their own and saw his death at the hands of the wealthiest man in Russia as just another example of the nobility's unchecked power. While the evidence points to a clear and singular story about Rasputin's murder, there is still so much shrouded in mystery about what in his life was real and what was contrived by a political machine dead set against him. Perhaps there are answers out there somewhere, but they remain elusive. After all, not everything found below the surface can be explained. Resources for today's story include an episode of the Rest is History podcast, Smithsonian Magazine, the National Library of Medicine, Library of Congress blogs, Progress Magazine, thehistoryreader.com, and excerpts from Douglas Smith's biography, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. Thank you for listening. We'd love for you to follow us on social media. We're on every major platform, so search for us on your favorites, and we'll be sure to include links in the show notes. You can also find us on our website, belowthesurfacepodcast.net. If you'd like to show your support for this show and get your episodes early and ad-free, consider an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, not only will you get early and ad-free access to this show, but to every show on the AbJack network of shows. To get started, just head over to Apple Podcasts and search for the AbJack Entertainment channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Finally, we'd very much appreciate you leaving a rating or review on the platform you're listening to us now on. This will really help us grow and it helps new listeners to find the show. And please tell your friends about Below the Surface. Nothing beats word of mouth. We will see you back in 2 weeks with an all-new episode. Thank you all so much.
Below the Surface is hosted and narrated by Olivia McKenzie, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro, and it's produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to join us for the next episode of Below the Surface.